because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And as my obsession grew, I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons, and eventually I did turn to cannibalism.
This is a notorious murderer. He took 17 lives. But murder was just the beginning for him. Dahmer also kept pictures of his victims, performed deviant acts with the corpses, and treated the bodies in unacceptable ways. Some victims were even experimented on to become servant tools. He had done all the most distorted and horrifying things that people could imagine. When he was brought to court, before the grief and anger of the victims' families, his face remained expressionless. He just calmly said, "I was wrong." So what was Dahmer really? A sick person or the embodiment of evil? This was a question that he, until the end of his life, could never answer. In July 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested. The scene that the police discovered made everyone shudder, from large containers and pots to many small boxes containing evidence. At that time, the media could not imagine the level of horror, only seeing the grimaces of the officers when informing the representative lawyer. Lawyer Wendy then contacted Dahmer's father, preparing for a tense trial. But surprisingly, Dahmer did not need to resist. He calmly confessed and asked strange questions. "Why didn't you kill me right away? I want to know who I am." The lawyer sent a female lawyer to talk to him. They recorded more than 32 hours of conversation to find evidence to see if Dahmer had a mental disorder. The police simultaneously collected evidence at the scene, comparing it with the list of missing people. For a whole year, Dahmer also participated in supporting the identification of victims through images. Gradually, his journey of crime was revealed. Dahmer's childhood was not peaceful. His father was a scientist, often away from home to study. His parents were in conflict, constantly arguing. His mother repeatedly acted violently towards his father. It was this environment that made Dahmer withdrawn, lonely, had few friends, was not good at studying, and had difficulty opening up to others. At the age of 13, he realized that he had a different tendency and began to have small experimental actions with his peers. Dahmer's most special hobby as a child was collecting and dissecting animals. He spent hours dissecting, observing the inside of the body, and then keeping the bones as a collection. This passion gradually turned into an obsession, making him increasingly isolated from others. The habit of direct contact with animal carcasses also made Dahmer's emotions numb and disappear. When he was in high school, Dahmer began to have strange illusions, even planning to attack a passerby. He once prepared tools to ambush, but in the end, that person did not appear, so the idea was abandoned. In 1978, Dahmer graduated from high school. At that time, his parents divorced. The mother kicked the father out of the house and then left, leaving Dahmer alone in the house, drowning in loneliness and despair. On June 18th, just 3 weeks after graduation, Dahmer met Stephen Hicks, a young hitchhiker. Stephen was on his way to a music festival. Dahmer was attracted by Stephen's strong appearance and invited him home for a beer. Stephen agreed, but then wanted to leave. Feeling afraid of being abandoned and the desire to control arose, Dahmer murdered Hicks. This was the beginning of a series of horrific crimes later. After murdering Stephen Hicks, Dahmer initially felt insecure. He hid the body in the basement, then dismembered it and threw some parts away. When the police suddenly stopped the car, Dahmer calmly lied that he was taking out the trash and was let go. This calmness made him realize that he could manipulate others with words to escape punishment. Sometime later, Dahmer's father returned and found his son drowning in alcohol, the house filled with bottles. He decided to send Dahmer to college, but he was soon expelled for alcoholism. Then his father sent Dahmer to the army for training. Here he chose to study first aid, knowing the location of body parts. But after a short time, Dahmer was expelled again for his drinking habit. Returning home, Dahmer was still haunted by his first crime. He returned to the place where he dumped Stephen Hicks' body to find bones and scattered them around. At first he felt guilty, but gradually his repression became weaker and weaker. In 1981, Dahmer moved to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. He tried to change, went to church, prayed, hoping to give up his deviant thoughts, but his inner instincts still arose. One time, Dahmer smuggled a mannequin home to use for sexual purposes, but his grandmother found out and made him take it away. The repression only lasted until Dahmer started working the night shift at a chocolate factory. Working the night shift allowed him to go out more often. Dahmer frequented gay bars in Milwaukee. At this time, he began using drugs to control his sexual partners, hoping to have absolute control. One time, he overdosed on drugs that left the victim unconscious, and he was banned from going to the public bathhouse. On November 20th, 1987, 9 years after the Hicks incident, Dahmer committed his second crime. The victim was Stephen Tuomi, a young man. Dahmer took Tuomi to a hotel, drank, and spent the night. The next morning, Dahmer woke up to find Tuomi dead. He claimed that he did not remember what he had done, possibly because he was drunk. But by instinct, Dahmer hid the body in a suitcase, brought it to her basement to deal with. This was considered a turning point when the demon in Dahmer really emerged. From here, Dahmer increasingly could not control his instincts. He appeared normal to his neighbors, but inside he continued to hide many secrets. He began to be interested in spells, horror movies, and demonic images, considering them as inspiration. 2 months later, on January 16, 1988, Dahmer approached James Dockstader, a young man of Indian origin. Dahmer promised to pay $50 in exchange for sex and a photo shoot. When James wanted to leave, Dahmer did not allow it and took the victim's life. The body was kept for a week to satisfy his obsession with control, and then was dealt with. In September 1988, Dahmer faced the law for the first time. He was accused of sexual misconduct with a 13-year-old boy. Dahmer lured him home to take pictures, then drugged him. When the victim returned home in a trance, the family immediately called the police. Dahmer was arrested and sentenced to a year of labor, but was released on bail while awaiting trial. Just a few months later, in March 1989, Dahmer continued to approach Anthony Sears, a handsome black young man. He took Anthony to her home, then repeated the drugging trick. Anthony became his next victim. Because he was so fascinated by Anthony's appearance, Dahmer decided to keep some body parts in a sealed box, hidden at his workplace. Anthony Sears' disappearance was reported to the police by friends and family. They got very close to Dahmer, but in the end, things did not progress. In May 1990, Jeffrey Dahmer moved from his grandmother's home to live in the Oxford Apartments in Milwaukee. This was a place where many black residents and immigrants lived. With a gentle, polite appearance, Dahmer quickly made a good impression on his neighbors. But inside that small apartment, he began a new phase of crimes, increasingly more frequent and dangerous. In the new apartment, Dahmer had the conditions to commit more gruesome acts. He collected photos of his victims, kept some body parts, and even thought about building an altar to demonstrate his control. Because the apartment was not convenient for using a sledgehammer, he bought a large barrel and acid to decompose the remains, then poured them down the drain. As for the skulls, he kept them as souvenirs. In May 1991, Dahmer approached Tony Hughes, a young man who was deaf. The story was similar to the previous cases, but this time Dahmer also performed a terrible experiment. He wanted to create a living zombie, someone who would listen and not abandon him. So Dahmer drilled a small hole in the victim's head and injected the solution. The experiment failed, and Tony died. Meanwhile, in gay bars, many people began to notice the disappearance of their friends. But because most of the victims were poor, black, or immigrant, the police paid little attention. In addition, this was also the period when the HIV/AIDS epidemic was raging. Many missing people were thought to have moved or died of the disease. That was what allowed Dahmer to continue his actions without being noticed. On May 27, 1991, Dahmer approached a Laotian boy named Konarak Sinthasomphone at a shopping mall. He lured Konarak back to his apartment to take pictures, then drugged him. After experimenting on the boy's head, Dahmer went out to buy beer. Konarak, in critical condition, escaped, naked and panicking. 2 black girls saw Konarak and called the police. When Dahmer returned, he convinced them that it was his boyfriend, just drunk. Although the two girls tried to protect Konarak, the police still chose to believe Dahmer. They even took the boy back to the apartment, where Tony Hughes's body was still in the bedroom. After the police left, Dahmer continued his behavior, causing Konarak's death. This incident later caused a stir when it was exposed. The public was outraged that the police had missed an opportunity to save the victim simply because they believed a white man instead of two witnesses of color. The two police officers involved were initially fired, but later reinstated on appeal, citing their respect for the LGBT community. The incident sparked protests for social justice. After Konarak, Dahmer continued to commit 4 more murders that same year. The frequency of his crimes increased. At first, it was every few years, then every few months, then every few weeks. Especially after losing his job at the chocolate factory, Dahmer's actions became more frequent. The foul smell from his apartment began to make neighbors complain, but Dahmer justified it by saying that the refrigerator was broken, the beef had been left for too long, and had spoiled. Some neighbors believed him, others were skeptical, but had no evidence. Meanwhile, Dahmer began to act more horribly, keeping some body parts for display, even trying to taste human flesh. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer approached Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old man. He lured Tracy to his apartment with the promise of taking pictures and paying. When entering the room, Dahmer handcuffed one of Tracy's hands and acted abnormally. However, Tracy remained calm, pretended to cooperate, and then found a way to escape. Tracy ran out into the street, met a patrolling police officer, and called for help. Thanks to Tracy, the police returned to Dahmer's apartment number 213 to find the handcuff key. There they discovered a knife hidden under the bed, then checked the refrigerator and saw a horrifying scene, a human head in the cooler. Searching the entire apartment, the police seized a lot of evidence. 3 intact skulls, 11 human skulls, bones, and many tools for the gruesome acts. After the police searched apartment number 213, the evidence they collected shocked the whole city of Milwaukee. Not only were there human heads in the refrigerator, they also discovered many body parts, tissues, bones, and even a barrel containing acid solution. In the small apartment, the scene was no different from a devil's laboratory. When questioned, Jeffrey Dahmer was surprisingly cooperative. He admitted to most of his actions, described each case, and even helped the police identify the victims through photos. During the entire testimony, Dahmer was not afraid or evasive. On the contrary, he was calm, sometimes calmly explaining why he did what he did. In court, Dahmer made the public even more angry. While the victims' families cried over their loss, he remained expressionless, simply saying, "I was wrong." At that time, lawyers and public opinion fiercely argued about whether Dahmer was mentally ill or not, because if he was confirmed to be mentally incompetent, he could avoid prison. Dahmer's lawyers presented evidence that he suffered from schizoid personality disorder and borderline personality disorder. They described Dahmer as someone who was always haunted by the fear of abandonment, and pointed out that he often attacked whenever his victims wanted to leave. The legal team also cited his obsession with control, wanting to turn others into tools to prove his mental state. However, the prosecution argued otherwise. They pointed out that Dahmer was fully aware that his actions were wrong. The evidence was that he always tried to hide them, from buying barrels of acid to get rid of evidence, to manipulating the police, even installing surveillance cameras at his workplace to avoid detection. These calculated actions showed that Dahmer was capable of distinguishing right from wrong and was in complete control of himself. The court had to carefully consider 2 factors to determine whether Dahmer was considered insane or not. 1. Did he clearly understand right from wrong? 2. Was he able to control his actions at the time of the crime? Finally, the jury concluded that Dahmer was completely sane. On February 17, 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was sentenced to 15 life sentences, equivalent to 957 years in prison. Wisconsin did not have the death penalty at that time, so this was the maximum sentence he could receive. The verdict was handed down, but the pain of the victims' families remained. They were outraged by the indifference of the police on many previous occasions that had given Dahmer the opportunity to continue his crimes. In particular, The Konarak Synthosamphone case became a clear demonstration of injustice in law enforcement when the testimony of two women of color was ignored. In prison, Dahmer showed strange changes. He attended Bible study sessions, asked to be baptized, and said he wanted to find salvation. Many people were skeptical that this was just a way for him to find peace after years of sin. But some prison guards affirmed that Dahmer truly showed repentance in the last years of his life. However, Dahmer's appearance in Columbia prison made many other prisoners angry. To them, he was the embodiment of evil, the one who sowed indelible pain. After being sentenced to 15 life terms, Jeffrey Dahmer was transferred to Columbia Correctional Facility in Wisconsin. With his notorious nature, he quickly became the center of attention in the prison. Some inmates were curious, others were indignant, believing that Dahmer did not deserve to live. In prison, Dahmer appeared cooperative and disciplined. He attended Bible classes, asked to be baptized, and repeatedly said that he repented. Some prison guards believed that Dahmer was truly repentant, but many outsiders considered this an act of seeking false peace. Regardless, Dahmer still caused a great division in public opinion. Although he appeared docile, Dahmer was still considered a monster by other inmates. It is said that he often joked about his crimes to tease others. This increased the hatred towards him. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to work with two other prisoners, Christopher Scarver and Jesse Anderson. When there were only 3 people left in the gym, Scarver used an iron bar to beat Dahmer to death. Jesse Anderson was also attacked and died. Dahmer's death was quick, almost identical to the way he had murdered his first victim. Jeffrey Dahmer's death immediately became the focus of the press. Many people thought this was final justice when he received a fitting end. Others questioned, did the prison intentionally leave it alone for another prisoner to take action? Regardless, the American public at that time hardly expressed any grief. On the contrary, many victims' families considered this a relief. After Dahmer's death, all of his personal assets were auctioned. A businessman bought them all and had them destroyed in a secret location, ensuring no one would be able to keep them as mementos. The apartment complex where Dahmer lived was also demolished, as the community did not want the haunting to continue. However, the echoes of the case did not disappear easily. It exposed many deep-rooted problems in American society in the 1980s and 1990s. Racism, indifference to vulnerable communities, and loopholes in the law enforcement system. If the police had not missed the opportunity to save Konarak Synthosamphone, perhaps some of the victims would not have died. The case also became a lesson in psychology and criminology. Experts debated the reasons why an ordinary person like Dahmer became a serial killer. Many theories revolved around a lonely childhood, an obsession with anatomy, an unacceptable sexual orientation, and repressed psychological trauma. But in the end, no one gave a complete answer. Dahmer himself admitted, "I don't know why I did those things." Today, Jeffrey Dahmer is still remembered as one of the most notorious killers of the 20th century. His story has been written into books, made into documentaries, and even made into television series, causing much controversy. Some people believe that it is a way to better understand crime, but others oppose it because they fear that overexploitation will cause further trauma to the victims' families. In the end, Dahmer's legacy is not morbid curiosity, but a warning. Society must pay more attention to the vulnerable, must monitor more closely signs of psychological deviation, because sometimes just a little indifference can create opportunities for terrible crimes to continue.